Moving into chapter 13 now, we're going to start talking about your third line of defense and specific immunity. So the branch of your immune system that does not really work until you get exposed to a particular microorganism. And this branch develops an arsenal of weapons, both cellular weapons and then antibody weapons, that are very, very specifically targeted to this microorganism that has invaded your body. So chapter 12, we were talking about non-specific things that work against a lot of different microorganisms, and you don't have to have a prior exposure. With chapter 13, everything we're talking about here, you actually have to meet the microorganism before you develop this specific arsenal of weapons. So for the first video lecture, we're just going to begin to have kind of an overview of the third line of defense. So again, this is specific and acquired, so you're not born with any immunity from this third line of defense. You got to be exposed to the microbe before you generate this set of weapons. It's stimulated by molecules that are called antigens or immunogens. You can use either one of those terms. Antigen actually means antibody generator. Immunogen means it generates an immune response. So, but yeah, those terms are basically used interchangeably. So you guys need to start thinking about antigens are on the invading microbes. That's something that you are going to respond to, your immune system is going to respond to. Some of the terminology sounds alike as you go through this branch of the immune system, as you guys will see. So these are going to be complex molecules. So they have 3D shapes, and they have very specific patterns that this branch of your immune system can recognize and respond to. They're usually proteins or carbohydrates or combinations of the two, large organic molecules that can form complex three-dimensional shapes. And as we'll see, antigens stimulate lymphocytes. So the lymphocytes, remember, those are a type of agranulocyte white blood cell. And these are the main players for your third line of defense. These are going to be our warriors for this branch of the immune system. And you've got two major types of lymphocytes, B cells and T cells. And as we're going to see, B cells are responsible for making those Y-shaped antibody weapons that we talked a little bit about when we went over the complement system in chapter 12. And T cells, there are different subsets of T cells that have different jobs in helping fight off infection, as we'll see. So again, antigens are usually very specific to particular microbes. So an antigen of a Salmonella bacteria is not going to be present on the surface of Staphylococcus bacteria. Unlike PAMPs, so PAMPs that we talked about that are involved in your second line of defense, those are molecules that like lots of bacteria would have in common, or lots of yeast species would have in common, things like that. Another feature of your third line of defense is this is the branch of your immune system that generates memory. So again, like if you were infected with chickenpox and this branch of your immune system responds, it develops memory. So the next time you get exposed to the chickenpox virus, you can respond super, super quickly and wipe out that virus before it even really makes you sick. So that involves memory, and we'll talk about how memory works as we move through this particular chapter. All right, just kind of a overview of lymphocyte development. So we talked about you've got two major types of lymphocytes. You've got B cells and T cells, and they're going to have different jobs with your third line of defense. And if you guys remember back in chapter 12, we went over the development of different blood cells in the bone marrow. So there is a lymphocyte stem cell that's unspecialized. It hasn't specialized yet into B cells or T cells. And based on your needs, as these guys divide, some of them are going to specialize into B cells and some are going to specialize into T cells. So these are both made in your bone marrow, and they get released. And so B cells are in the bloodstream, but they exit the bloodstream and they go to locations. Remember when we were talking about the lymphatic system, we mentioned that you need white blood cells stationed in these lymphatic organs because those are great places for them to intercept invading microorganisms. So yes, B cells will be in the blood, they do migrate around, but a lot of them are going to be stationed in places like the lymph nodes, the spleen, your tonsils, the galt down in your the GALT, galt, that we talked about down in your intestinal tract, because those are great places for these B cells to try to find the foreign invaders that they're supposed to respond to. All right, your T cells, when they leave the bone marrow, they migrate first to the thymus. And so they fully mature in the thymus first. The thymus is a gland that sits up on top of the heart. And then they get released from the thymus and they go and hang out in these lymphatic tissues as well, tonsils, lymph nodes, spleen, etc. All right, so that's the early part of development. That's sometimes called the antigen-independent development, because everything you see up here takes place before a B cell or T cell is ever exposed to an antigen. So an antigen, again, that's going to be the marker on the surface of a microorganism that's going to trigger a response. And the rest of your development over here occurs after exposure of a B cell or T cell to an antigen, so this foreign molecule. And as we're going to see, when a B cell sees an antigen or a T cell sees an antigen, it winds up dividing over and over and over again and creates a population of clones, basically. We'll be talking more about that. And your B cells, when they get activated, they ultimately start producing these molecules that are called antibodies. Those are proteins that will attach to microorganisms and play a role in helping clear them out of the body. And then your T cells, there are different populations of T cells. So some T cells become what we call T helper cells that, as the name suggests, they help out other branches of your immune system. Some of them become cells called the T cytotoxic cells or cytotoxic T cells. And these are really interesting because those are cells that are actually going to murder cells in your body that have intracellular microorganisms, viruses, bacteria, protozoans, etc. Then there's a third branch called the T regulatory cells that are involved in regulating your immune responses, and I think that topic goes beyond what we need to cover in an introductory microbiology class. So I know you guys will be reading about these T regulatory cells as you go through chapter 13, and that's just to give you a little bit of exposure from your reading. We're not going to be discussing those in any detail in this class. All right, so just as a reminder, lymphocytes are stationed in these lymphatic organs like lymph nodes. So remember, if you've got here's a cross section through a lymph node again, and what happens is the T cells tend to be located in here in the center of the lymph node, and the B cells are kind of out here around the edges. And as we're going to wind up seeing, most B cells need cooperation from T cells. They need some T cell friends to kind of help them get stimulated and do their job. So it's really good that these cells are all clustered together inside these lymph nodes. And anytime lymph nodes have these afferent lymphatic vessels that are bringing in fluids, microorganisms, things like that are draining off of your tissues. So if you have an infection, those microorganisms, some of those are going to drain into the lymph node as well. And those microorganisms have antigens associated with them. And so it's good that they're draining into a lymph node because you've got all these T cells and B cells that are concentrated there, and it makes it easier for these T cells and B cells to detect these invading microorganisms and respond to them. Now imagine if your B cells and T cells were just scattered all over the place. It might be very difficult for these microorganisms and B cells or T cells to find each other. So it creates a very favorable location for concentrating all these things together to try to stimulate this branch of your immune system. All right, so that's kind of an introductory video lecture for this branch of our immune system, third line of defense. In the next video lecture, we're going to discuss these B cells and T cells in a little bit more detail. What's different about B cells and T cells, and why do we need both of those cell types? So we'll begin to discuss more about those two cell types in the second video lecture.